Good evening and welcome. I'm Amanda Mcmullen, President and CEO of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight to kick off the annual Moby-Dick Marathon. Truth be told, this isn't how we imagined ringing in our 25th celebration of this classic. But this event holds a special place in all of our hearts. And as they say, the show must go on. Throughout this past year, we embrace technology to bring you the museum's rich content and vibrant programs. I want to thank all of our sponsors who made this weekend possible, and importantly, the museum staff, our incredible volunteers and docents, and our amazing trustees. Our whole team has embraced Melville's words, "I try all things, I achieve what I can." And we've achieved quite a bit these past many months, and I know tonight will be no exception. A very special thanks goes to our longstanding partners at the Melville Society Cultural Project. Their expertise and creativity knows no bounds. They help expand our perspectives and they deepen our appreciation for this great American novel. And that brings me to welcome Wynn Kelly, one of the Melville scholars, who's going to tell us a bit more about our special guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Amanda. Good evening, and thank you all on behalf of the Melville Society Cultural Project for attending this lecture and opening event in the New Bedford Whaling Museum's annual Moby-Dick Marathon, now in its quarter-century year. It is a joy to introduce to you someone I deeply admire as a scholar, collaborator, officer of the Melville Society, and friend. Steven Olsen-Smith is professor of English at Boise State University and general editor of Melville's Marginalia Online, where he has greatly advanced the scholarship on Melville's books, the 1,000 or more volumes in his personal library, and Melville's markings in those books. But as you will see, Professor Olsen-Smith has also adopted and transformed sophisticated technologies for reading and reproducing Melville's annotations. Quite simply, he is the leading figure in recovering, editing, and theorizing Marginalia as revealing an author's reading, thinking, and writing practices. Professor Olsen-Smith is the author of many scholarly articles, and most recently his book, Melville in His Own Time, a biographical chronicle of his life drawn from recollections, interviews, and memoirs by family, friends, and associates. He has also created scholarly digital editions of works by Stephen Crane and Walt Whitman. He is past president and for many years untiring treasurer of the Melville Society and has held visiting appointments as the Holland H. Coors Endowed Chair at the United States Air Force Academy. We take great pleasure in bringing him to the New Bedford Whaling Museum this year. If you have a question for Professor Olsen-Smith, please put it in the chat, for which you will find an icon at the bottom of your screen. I will collect and convey your questions to Professor Olsen-Smith. Tonight's talk is entitled, "A Wonder, a Grandeur, and a Woe, Melville and Human Progress." Please join me in welcoming Professor Steven Olsen-Smith.
Ahoy, shipmates. Am I coming through audibly? Okay, great. Thank you, Wynn, for that very nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to express my appreciation to Wynn and the members of the Melville Society Cultural Project, and of course, to the New Bedford Whaling Museum for these arrangements. Unfortunately, I have never participated in your annual Moby-Dick Marathon reading before. Distance and timing have just never worked out for me since I wrote my dissertation on Melville at the University of Delaware, graduating in 1999. And so it is a thrill and a real honor to be participating in this capacity, helping to kick off the 25th annual reading with my contribution this evening. So thrilled and honored to be here. Thank you. There are a number of factors that brought me to tonight's subject of Melville and the question of human progress. Not least our historically remarkable, if not exactly grand, contested election for the presidency of the United States and everything it's exemplified about the current state of our society. Given the timing of the legislative events, I expected those factors to reach a crescendo this week. Of course, they delivered, and how, presenting a timely context for this discussion. It would be perfectly natural to ask how the author of Moby-Dick and The Confidence Man would react to post-election events if he were here with us today. But I'd like instead to begin by asserting that he already has offered a substantial response in his writings. One of the premises of his position on human nature being that in a lot of respects, things were no different in his own time from conditions preceding it by hundreds of years, and that not much prospect existed in his own time for improvement centuries hence. Tonight, I'll lay out evidence for that, but not without also demonstrating that Melville was uncomfortable with his own skepticism on the subject, that he revered the instinct towards optimism, and that his position on human progress ultimately transcends settled convictions and either-or formulations. At the very least, I hope we'll conclude with a renewed sense about the prominence of human progress among the large universal problems that define his thought and writing, and that played no small role in Melville's reading of other writers. And with that, I will share my screen here. This talk is roughly organized according to the following topics. Subject of Melville and human progress as an abiding preoccupation in his reading, as revealed by quantitative evidence, as well as specific examples of marginalia, as construed through the portrayal of Ahab and other characters in Moby-Dick, through the lens of modern anthropological theories, with which I'll conclude, and from which we'll turn to discussion and questions that I'll do my best to answer under Wynn's moderation towards the end of the hour. As Wynn mentioned in her kind introduction, I coordinate the efforts of contributing scholars and students at Melville's Marginalia Online, a virtual archive of marked and annotated books that survive from the author's library, which numbered some 1,000 volumes at the time of his death, but were dispersed when Elizabeth Melville prepared to vacate their home on Manhattan's East Side and moved to smaller quarters. As shown here in video capture, the project displays digital facsimile copies of surviving books, such as Thomas Beale's The Natural History of the Sperm Whale, Melville's source for whaling information in Moby-Dick. Visitors can also search Melville's Marginalia by keyword, as we'll see here in a moment. Keyword, as demonstrated here for the term humanity, which brings us to a number of hits in the project's digital copies of books, arriving here at Marginalia. Melville inscribed in a copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. Very soon, as announced at the lower right corner of the site pictured here, visitors to the site will have the ability to visualize marked content with an integrated version of Voyant tools. What we're looking at represents all of the marginalia at the project encoded to date, including Melville's copies of Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, and others. Among the high-frequency substantive terms in that set of marked content, the word man exceeds all others in frequency, representing a variety of different usages, but tending toward observations on human nature and about humanity in the abstract. An example pertinent to tonight's subject appears here in Melville's Marginalia to Milton's Paradise Lost, where God the Father describes his pending creation of human beings as a means of counteracting the damage caused by the rebellion of Satan and his fallen angels. And I'll just read the passage aloud here. In God's words, but lest his, Satan's heart exalt him in the harm already done, to have dispeopled heaven, my damage fondly deemed. I can repair that detriment, if such it be to lose self-lost, and in a moment will create another world, out of one man, a race of men innumerable, there to dwell, not here, till by degrees of merit raised, they open to themselves at length the way up hither under long obedient stride, and earth be changed to heaven, and heaven to earth, one kingdom, joy, and union without end. Now, it should be emphasized that in Milton's theology, this vision of human progress by degrees applies to God's intentions for humanity before the fall. One of the consequences of the fall, or of post-lapsarian experience, being Adam and Eve's loss of the capacity for merit-based self-development, their willful sacrifice of the contributory human role associated with this paradigm, requiring instead a sacrifice by Christ the Son for human redemption. Now, the marginalia on this page is largely erased, but you might be able to make out the pencil score that Melville has applied to that entire passage. Moreover, the key term in question appears in both marked text and in Melville's erased annotation to the passage, which has been deciphered at Melville's Marginalia online through technical recovery. And let me just give a moment for that to display here. Okay, there it is, with the term man outlined in red in both the text area and Melville's annotation there. And in a couple of moments, we'll take a look at that recovered annotation and how Melville responded to this vision of human destiny. But first, let's return to the word cloud briefly and note that in addition to the noun man, the term like appears at roughly the same frequency, indicating Melville's attention to poetic similes and other forms of comparison in his reading. Another example of which from Milton compares Satan's emergence from hell and chaos and his approach to Eden like a weather-beaten vessel with shrouds and tackle torn. Melville very frequently, as you can imagine, marked nautical references in his marginalia wherever he encountered them. Homeric and Miltonic extended or epic similes play a vital rhetorical role in Moby-Dick, the very first of which appears in chapter 9, the sermon, where we encounter Melville's depiction of a post-lapsarian human state in the fugitive Jonah, and where for his own sin of disobedience, Jonah suffers forlornly in his stateroom aboard the vessel on which he is booked passage. Like one who after a night of drunken revelry hies to his bed, still reeling, but with conscience yet pricking him, as the plungings of the Roman racehorse, but so much the more strike his steel tags into him. As one who in that miserable plight still turns and turns in giddy anguish, praying God for annihilation until the fit be past. And at last, amid the whirl of woe he feels, a deep stupor steals over him, as over the man who bleeds to death, for conscience is the wound, and there's naught to staunch it. So, after sore wrestlings in his birth, Jonah's prodigy of ponderous misery drags him drowning down to sleep. In keeping with the sustained depiction of Jonah in Father Mapple's sermon, he here represents the sinner's absolute inability to save himself and his utter dependence on God for salvation, demanding obedience. Mapple's portrayal stems not from a progressive view of human destiny, but one of faith and obedience up until the end times and the final judgment. As we know, it holds forth a standard for humanity's behavior and self-image that is rejected by Ahab, the ungodly, godlike man, who in the spirit of Milton's Satan insists upon treating with all powers upon an equal basis. It also contrasts with the paradigm for human progress by degrees of merit raised that Melville marked and annotated in Paradise Lost. For Melville's erased annotation there describes it as a grand thought, though fanciful, finally, that man was made to this end. Now, it's not clear whether Melville was inattentive to the pre- and post-lapsarian distinctions involved with this passage, or if he was just uninterested in them. What we can confidently observe is that for Melville's frame of mind at the time of inscription, the question of human progress appeared more wishful than realistic. Now, it might be argued that Melville's skepticism here applies more to the grand cosmic outcome projected by Milton and less to the question of whether human beings en masse are capable of amelioration. But we can return to the text of Moby-Dick and to the passage that furnished the title of my talk this evening to examine how Melville responded further to Milton at the beginning of chapter 107, The Carpenter. Seat thyself sultanically among the moons of Saturn, and take high abstracted man alone, and he seems a wonder, a grandeur, and a woe. But from the same point, take mankind in mass, and for the most part, they seem a mob of unnecessary duplicates, both contemporary and hereditary. As my co-editors at Melville's Marginalia Online, Peter Norberg and Dennis Marnin and I observed when we first published this evidence in the Melville journal Leviathan, the opening clause of this passage emulates the divine perspective of the marked and annotated passage in Milton, while the closing clause seems worded to dismiss its claims for historical and evolutionary human progression. The progression of the passage from high abstracted man to a mob of unnecessary duplicates likewise mirrors Melville's conception of Milton's teleological vision as a grand thought that is, in the end, fanciful rather than accurate. We find similar thoughts on human character as hereditarily fixed and unamended over time elsewhere in the surviving record of Melville's reading. In his Marginalia to Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well, an erased annotation on Parolles, the unsavory liar and braggart who is eventually exposed and disgraced in the play, opens with Melville's proposition that as 2 and 2 made 4 in Noah's time, as now, so man figures ever, before going on to claim that Parolles is the type of a character one might easily encounter in a railroad car of the most mighty 19th century. In the opening clause here, Melville's art for meaningful allusion is on display with its reference to Noah, by whose time humanity had grown so wicked, the book of Genesis tells us, that God determined to wash the earth clean and start over. With sarcastic hyperbole in the closing clause, Melville indicates that human nature in his own time was not only no less compromised than in Noah's, but that it fatuously believed the opposite of itself. As the industrialized association indicates, Melville's main target in the passage, as throughout his writings, is Western chauvinism and American exceptionalism. But the trans-global and trans-historical sweep of the annotation is significant, as is the universalizing rhetoric of the terms man and men in the word cloud we observed. In the words of Ishmael standing before the exposed and rundown Spouter Inn in chapter 3, it's too late to make any improvements now. The universe is finished, the copestone is on, and the chips were carted off 1,000,000 years ago. As stated at the outset, I don't think Melville rested comfortably in this perspective, notwithstanding the abundance of examples we're examining here. And as we'll see, there's basis for believing that in late stages of the composition of Moby-Dick particularly, Melville took measures to counteract and balance this view of human experience in his master work, but not without first expressing it with wonder, grandeur, and woe in a passage that I consider to be among the most significant in all of his master work, one that duplicates the contrast in Melville's annotation to Shakespeare between modern mighty exceptionalism and what he considered to be the oppressive and inescapable realities of human experience. In chapter 41, entitled Moby-Dick, while rendering his account of Ahab's dismemberment by the white whale and the insanity that follows, Melville employs an extended metaphor based on the Grand Hôtel des Cluny of Paris and its foundation upon ancient Roman ruins, shifting the point of view to address us directly as readers. He suggests that if we wish to understand Ahab's outrage and motives, we ourselves must descend to where far beneath the fantastic towers of man's upper earth, his root of grandeur, his whole awful essence sits in bearded state, an antique buried beneath antiquities, enthroned on torsos. So with a broken throne, the great gods mock that captive king. So like a caryatid, patient sits, upholding on his frozen brow the piled entablatures of ages. Wind ye down there, ye prouder, sadder souls. Question that proud, sad king. A family likeness he did beget ye, ye young exiled royalties, and from your grim sire only will the old state secret come. The image I'm displaying alongside this passage was remarked upon widely in 1849 by contemporary newspaper notices of Austin Henry Layard's Nineveh and its Remains, which had already influenced Melville's thought and imagery in his previous two books, Redburn and Whitejacket. Melville was familiar with the ancient Assyrian Empire and its capital city from biblical and historical sources, and direct references in his previous two books signal his awareness of Layard's excavations in the 1840s of the ancient palace of Nimrud outside of Mosul in modern-day Iraq. In a talk delivered from Melville at 200, available at the Melville's Marginalia online website, I've made a case for its influence on imagery in the present passage. And I also see Layard's influence in the cyclical process it implies about the rise and fall of civilizations, a circular history of dreary repetition rather than of steady progress. Nineveh was lauded by 19th century historians and poets as a great city of cities, and its demise fascinated the Western imagination. In the image of the captive king, we have an apt counterpart for high abstracted man alone, a wonder, a grandeur, and a woe. In the imagery of descent and excavation, informed by Layard's illustrations, and of broken and mutilated statuary among the piled entablatures of ages, we detect the violence, destruction, and erosion to which all human experience and aspiration are subject. By contrasting these dark underlying realities with the fantastic towers of upper earth, Melville constructs yet another dualism between surface and depth, perception and reality, passing preeminence and abiding retrogression in human history. This metaphorical construct and the examples we've noted from Melville's Marginalia offer a potential parallel to what social scientists refer to as veneer theory, involving the proposition that civilized society and the trajectory of social progress we associate with it constitute a thin surface or crust, a culturally constructed veneer under which constantly lurks and above which frequently erupts the brute and amoral realities of nature that determine our being and our destiny. Although it is a 20th century coinage, veneer theory is often associated with Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, where the 17th century English philosopher introduced his concept of the social contract by which civilized societies seek to hold at bay the state of nature and escape what Hobbes called the war of all against all. We know from research recently shared by Scott Norsworthy at melvilliana.org that Melville owned a copy of the original 1651 edition of Leviathan, and that it was reportedly much valued, quote unquote, by him, though unfortunately Melville's copy is not known to survive. Melville's contrast between the fantastic towers of man's upper earth and the underlying historically repetitive cycle of civilization and decay in the piled entablatures of ages lends itself to the veneer theory, whereby faith in civilized historical progress is undermined by the realities of violence and destruction. The image of the captive king, buried beneath antiquities, enthroned on torsos, presents us with a picture of human grandeur undermined by the woeful material realities of its natural condition. Melville applied the concept more explicitly than this in later writings. The compressed condition of the captive king, for example, corresponds to the, quote, dense oppression described by the speaker in Melville's Civil War poem, The Housetop. During the Manhattan draft riots of July 1863, we're told, all civil charms and priestly spells, which lately held hearts in awe, fear-bound, subjected to a better sway than sway of self. These like a dream dissolve, and man rebounds whole eons back in nature. Further evoking associations with the grand but afflicted king beneath the Hotel de Cluny and contrasted qualities of our nature, the event constitutes a grimy slur, the poem tells us, upon the civil assumption that man is naturally good and more is nature's Roman, never to be scourged. Still more, Melville's poem, The Apparition, presents the American Civil War in the image of a, quote, goblin mountain that abruptly upheaves and then again descends beneath the surface of perceived reality and consciousness, concluding, so then, solidity's a crust, the core of fire below, all may go well for many a year, but who can think without a fear of horrors that happen so? Solidity is a crust. There, in both imagery and sentiment, we see how closely Melville's concept of a Hobbesian underlying state of nature corresponds to modern veneer theory. In Moby-Dick, its significance is often subtly communicated and veiled, as in the Hotel de Cluny passage. But we know from other chapters that motifs of assumption and projection abound in the book, with fragile states of stability undermined by abrupt transitions from security to insecurity and from peacefulness to peril, as in Ishmael's description of the whale line in chapter 60, which despite its calm appearance when coiled, symbolizes the ever-present perils of life when whipped into play. To the onset of the typhoon in the Candles chapter, which will sometimes burst from out this cloudless sky like an exploding bomb upon a dazed and sleepy town. Although Melville preceded by a century and a half its formal naming by the primatologist Franz de Waal, veneer theory had circulated in various forms since Hobbes, and it was fully compatible with the conceptual world of Moby-Dick and other writings by Melville, and he was attentive to both expressions of the theory and challenges to it in his reading. In his copy of Madame de Staël's Germany, which he acquired a decade later in 1862, Melville encountered a passage he might well have construed as a rebuttal to his paragraph on the captive king. Those who deny the perfectibility of the human understanding, de Staël contends, pretend that progression and decline follow each other by turns, and that the wheel of thought rolls round like that of fortune. What a sad spectacle is this. The generations of men employing themselves upon earth like Sisyphus in hell, in constant and useless labor. And what would then be the destiny of the human race when it resembled the most cruel punishment with the imagination of poetry has conceived? But it is not thus, and we can perceive a destiny always the same, always consequential, always progressive in the history of man. With its equation of historical generations to the recurrent punishment of Sisyphus, condemned in the underworld to roll a stone up a hill only to resume his labor after it immediately rolls back down again. Madame de Stael's conceit corresponds to the condition of the mocked and abused captive king upholding on his frozen brow the piled entablatures of ages. But she describes the scenario in order to reject it, asserting that she can perceive a progressive course in history towards nothing short of the perfectibility of human comprehension of the world and of itself. Melville's great respect for Madame de Stael is apparent throughout his Marginalia in this 2-volume work, including his unelaborated emendation to her wording, an annotation that stems modestly but resolutely from the negative interpretation of experience he had associated with Ahab and Moby-Dick, as we've seen would go on to assert at points in battle pieces. Insofar as Moby-Dick is the story of Ahab, and the captive king metaphor the key to comprehending Ahab's cosmic grievances, Melville's masterwork presents a bleak view of human experience and progress. But too bleak, I believe, in Melville's own judgment, once he had formulated and substantially carried out the story of Ahab's catastrophic pursuit of the white whale. In the absence of surviving manuscript evidence, theories about the genesis of Moby-Dick and its various states of composition are conjectural, to use Melville's term. But the most sophisticated contribution to date remains Harrison Hayford's Unnecessary Duplicates, a key to the writing of Moby-Dick. There, Hayford borrows Melville's wording from the beginning of chapter 107 to describe the curious duplication of subject matter in the narrative, primarily in the book's opening short chapters, where we encounter 2 inns, 2 innkeepers, 2 beds, 2 goings to bed, 2 captain owners of the Pequod, 2 different signing aboard scenes, and last but not least, 2 characters Melville intended for Ishmael's companions. Bulkington, who is introduced but ceremoniously dismissed from the narrative, and Bulkington's replacement, Queequeg, whom Hayford suggests had already been present in the narrative as a minor character, then as now perhaps one of the ship's pagan harpooneers, when Melville decided to develop him in the short chapters as Ishmael's bosom friend, but did not go on to continue developing his role substantially in the story of Ahab, who as the 3rd captain figure is not literally introduced until after the Pequod embarks on its voyage. With Queequeg's development in the short chapters, we see rhetorical elements and themes only briefly addressed in the sea narrative, as in chapter 94, a squeeze of the hand, where Ishmael's desire to abandon all social acerbities and the slightest ill humor or envy in favor of, quote, the very milk and sperm of kindness, culminates in a vision of long rows of angels in paradise, each with his hand in a jar of spermaceti. A path to salvation facilitated not by orthodox conceptions of merit and obedience communicated in the marked passage of Paradise Lost with which we started this evening, but by Ishmael's experience of fond camaraderie and goodwill. Ishmael's experience in the short chapters of repulsion and fear of Queequeg, followed by accommodation, sustained contact, both physical and emotional, attraction, and a figurative marriage with the tattooed cannibal, effectively infused the narrative by virtue of their development in the earliest chapters of the book, with an alternative ethos and interpretation of reality that ultimately sets both characters, Ishmael and Queequeg, apart from the Hobbesian veneer theory of experience associated with Ahab. With the development of Queequeg as Ishmael's bosom friend, the emergence of Queequeg's coffin lifeboy as a means of his deliverance in the epilogue, which may have been already formulated and perhaps even already written by Melville when he expanded the short chapters, was infused with these associations, transforming it from the exclusively morbid image it would have been without them. In so doing, this aspect of the narrative invites a different and more recently expounded theory of human experience and development. The friendliness theory, put forth by scientists Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods in their book, Survival of the Friendliest. The two argue that up until the rise of civilization as we know it, which introduced stationary existence, property ownership, and ultimately nation states, history was not the horror show depicted by Hobbes. For by far the majority of human existence, they argue, friendliness was an advantageous evolutionary strategy, one that can be adopted anew to counter contemporary assumptions latent within and explicit to veneer theory, as well as later formulations such as social Darwinism and concepts of the survival of the fittest in a world of factors stacked against or piled on a human race characterized by war of all against all. Now, I don't mean to suggest that by introducing Queequeg and Ishmael's friendship at the start of the narrative, Melville intended to unsay or even to gainsay the dark vision he associated with Ahab in Moby-Dick. We've examined examples of that vision in his writing and reading of works that occurred later than the composition of his masterwork. And it seems clear to me that both tendencies were central to his interpretation of human experience. Moreover, there was much in the antebellum and Gilded Ages to reinforce his pessimistic tendencies, and much in his lifelong reading to affirm his sense of an artist's role in a corrupt society. Central to this self-image was his enthusiastic embrace of esoteric expression and a conception of reality and experience which served that artistic agenda. Early on in Hawthorne and His Mosses, he described Shakespeare's short, quick probings at the very axis of reality, observing that the bard craftily says, or sometimes insinuates the things, which we feel to be so terrifically true, that it were all but madness for any good man in his own proper character to utter or even hint of them. There, his conception of artistic concealment and disclosure extended to the nature of truth itself, with his beautiful conceit that in this world of lies, truth is forced to fly like a scared white doe in the woodlands, and only by cunning glimpses will she reveal herself, as in Shakespeare and other masters of the great art of telling the truth, even though it be covertly and by snatches. Attention to esoteric forms of expression appear far and wide in surviving Marginalia by Melville that date to the period of Moby-Dick and beyond, as late as the 1870s, when he acquired his copy of Thomas Warton's History of English Poetry. He was still marking passages like the one here, excerpted by Warton from Thomas Wilton's Art of Rhetoric. The poets are wise men, and wished in heart the redress of things, the which when for fear they durst not openly rebuke, they did in colors paint them out, and told men by shadows what they should do in good sooth. Or else because the wicked were unworthy to hear the truth, they spake so that none might understand, but those unto whom they pleased to utter their meaning, and knew them to be men of honest conversation. That Melville himself wished in heart the redress of things is the inescapable conclusion to draw from his lifelong devotion to questions of human progress and of prospects for collective fulfillment in human life. Nathaniel Hawthorne's well-known observation that about Melville and religious faith, that he could neither believe nor be comfortable in his unbelief, and was too honest and courageous not to try to do one or the other, might also be applied to the question of Melville's faith in humanity. In our own time, itself gridlocked between warring notions about the horizon of possibilities for social transformation and the limits imposed upon us by all too worldly and all too human conditions. Melville's example as a thinker and artist offers, if not answers and solutions, at least a model of intellectual resolve for pursuing them. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to ask Wynn to open the floor for questions and discussion. I think you're muted, Wynn.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question from Tim Marr, who, and I'm just reading this for the first time, so if I stumble, it's because it's new to me. Might Melville conjecture that going beneath the veneer and crust in some way might pare away a primeval connection with the incorrupt nature of prelapsarian Eden? Is, quote, the primeval savageness which ever slumbers in humankind, civilized or uncivilized, also a Queequegian redress to the primal ground of inert creativity that re-inhabits the friendly celestial?
Well, that is an elegant and beautifully worded question that I wish I could have pasted into a slide for the present talk, Tim. Thank you for that very much. And it's actually a question I would prefer to study for a while before I endeavor to provide an answer to it. But I think I'll just restrict my response to the first thing that popped in my mind as Wynn was reading it, and that was that that Melville considered, as we know, the pursuit of truth, wherever it may lead, whether to affirmative or discomfiting destinations, was a noble endeavor, and that an honest comprehension of the truth, however unsettling and dispiriting, is a more noble form of existence than shutting our eyes to the dark realities of experience and insisting upon the very often self-serving affirming projections and assumptions that guide our lives individually and socially. And so I suspect that Melville would in the end have argued that grappling with these sorts of dark, forbidden, unsettling truths is the first step involved with confronting them in a way that helps us to ultimately grow beyond them. At least I'd like to believe that about his perspective.
Thank you, Steve. We have a quick question about people not being able to see the questions, and I'm very sorry about that. I've been asked to read them, and I will be as clear and careful as I can. But if you have if you've missed it or you want me to read it again, I'm glad to do it. The next question is from Alyssa Greenwald. She asks, can you discuss what is known about how Melville changed Moby-Dick after meeting Hawthorne?
Well, not with authority. No one can. As I mentioned, so little evidence actually survives. We have some forms of external evidence in the forms of his references to the book and in letters, and to some of his references by his contemporary acquaintances to the work. A couple of whom, or at least one of whom, likely saw the manuscript. And we have the internal evidence of these duplicates and other forms of anomaly in the text that that many scholars have identified since the middle of the 20th century, and that Hayford, as I observed, has so far provided, I feel, the most precise engagement with those internal anomalies. But if we are to reflect on the possibilities of where the narrative might have gone after his friendship with Hawthorne. I think we can look back on the history of some of his earlier works. Marty started out, we know, as a rather straightforward adventure narrative, and within the period of composition, Melville discovered Sir Thomas Browne and other Elizabethan worthies, and engaged closely with Plato and other writers he revered for the first time, and he decided mid-composition to transform it very radically. And I am a member of the scholarly camp that believes that something very similar happened to Moby-Dick, that it began as a rather straightforward adventure of whaling, and that as a result of a rather complex chemistry that involves his elated experience of befriending Nathaniel Hawthorne, but also his rediscovery of Shakespeare, the Marginalia in which much of it dates to this period of the year immediately preceding composition, and we can assume during the period of composition. And we can add to that his relocation from New York City to the pastoral environment of Western Massachusetts and the Berkshires, which resulted in so much of the ebullient pastoral natural imagery in Moby-Dick that somewhat counterintuitively, but still beautifully informs his descriptions of the sea and nautical settings and situations. But my own conviction is that the book started out, or at least advanced to a point where Peleg was the intended captain figure for the narrative. And as Hayford argues, Peleg was later supplanted by Ahab, a much grander, more majestic, more Shakespearean character, which obviously we can trace to his engagement with Shakespeare, but which I think we can also trace to Hawthorne in connection with the great excitement that Melville experienced as a result of meeting this older author and befriending him, and the close intimacy they developed, and the nights they spent together talking about life, the universe, and everything over brandy and cigars. So I do believe that Hawthorne was a very important catalyst among those two other factors.
Okay, Stephen, the questions are pouring in, so I'm going to select what I can, and I can tell you they're wonderful. Here's a question from Jonathan Lopes asking, this is about the word clouds, are there any patterns you've noticed in your analysis in the word clouds? For example, rhythm of phrases, composition of language, use of words?
Okay, those are terrific questions. And as we'll see shortly on Melville's Marginalia Online, when we can finally go public with the Voyant platform integration, and that I'm pretty confident that's going to happen within the next month or two. There are a variety of tools there in addition to the word cloud, one of which is a phrase tool, right? So Voyant will work with singular key terms, but it will also demonstrate identical phrases that show up in quantity. And there is also a topic modeling feature in Voyant that will, according to an algorithm, look at each instance of marginalia and try to come up with general groupings and connections of terms that suggest the presence of specific topics within the marginalia. And your question is wonderful, as I suggested. Unfortunately, insofar as getting my hands deep into the functionality, much of the resource and its advantages is going to be as fresh and new to me once it finally goes public, because up until this time I've been dealing with all of the deeply quotidian technical issues associated with integrating this data analysis tool into the Melville site, working with the developers who were performing the actual programming for us to make sure that these visualizations can link to the actual page images available through the site, and make sure that users have swift and ready navigation to the primary facsimile evidence. But the short answer to your question is that there are some tools in the suite that enable that kind of analysis, but by turning loose this resource to the larger academic community, I am very much hopeful that more scholars of Melville and more scholars generally will work closely with Melville's Marginalia, both through the close examination of holograph evidence in the facsimile images, but also use this new technology to great advantage in terms of both access and analysis of the Marginalia, resulting, I'm confident, in new insights about Melville's reading practices and the connections between his reading and his writing of the sort that you've addressed in your very good question.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad that there are two questions about veneer theory, because I was excited about that too. And I thought I'd get them to you both because they're sort of related. The first is from Christopher Dean, who asks, if veneer theory connects with the character of Ahab and the friendliness theory connects with the character of Queequeg, can you connect any theory to the character of Starbuck? And then Ira Spiegel asks, is veneer theory a precursor or relative of naturalism, the sort Thomas Hardy is associated with?
Okay. Well, theory to associate with Starbuck, my first inclination there is to fall back on a point that I made in the talk about Father Mapple's sermon, which sort of sets the standard for orthodox conduct. That is a standard that Melville rejects, and I've always read Starbuck as Mapple's representative aboard the Pequod. It is Starbuck who is the recognizably devout and Orthodox Christian who accurately recognizes Ahab's intentions as blasphemous, but is powerless to change his course. That exchange in the quarterdeck chapter, where Starbuck raises that objection, and Ahab takes him down to the little lower layer to provide his inversion of Plato's cave parable as a scenario by which the thinker makes it out of the cave and only beholds a deeper darkness associated with the intelligence behind it. That exchange is a great example of some of the rhetorical ploys that Melville adopted from Elizabethan writers as a means of communicating dark truths behind a mask, as Melville put it in his Marginalia to Milton. Starbuck, the character, is there dutifully to accuse Ahab as blasphemy, right? And as a result, he's condemned. Ahab is easily construed as insane or mad. And in constructing this scenario, Melville was doing the same thing that he annotated and marked in a play by John Ford, in which an orthodox and devout thinker is condemning another character for his incestuous desire for his sister. And in Melville's annotation to that passage, now erased but substantially recovered, Melville refers to the impersonating ways of great geniuses as a way of describing this sort of strategy, holding up a minor character as a mask behind which the author can pull his strings, delving deep down into forbidden subjects and illicit associations and ideas. And so if there was any theory I would be inclined to associate with Starbuck. I can't think of a label to apply to it right off the bat, but it is a theory that would need to apply to that sort of role that Starbuck is there to play within the narrative. And this idea of concealed disclosures, communicating dark truths under the radar, I'm convinced this was not a sustained theory of artistry that was maintained right up to the end of Moby-Dick. Many of the blasphemies that are associated with Queequeg's character, one of the reasons I think these were late additions is that the blasphemies are so overt, right? Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. I'll try a pagan friend because Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. And then of course the violation of the first commandment when Ishmael bows down and worships Yojo. These are quite explicit. These are very different from the under the radar forms of philosophical and artistic expression that I think he depended upon in the narrative associated with Ahab and veneer theory and the dark truths that he felt were associated with it. But Starbuck is in many respects a figure who stands in for Mapple. In between, perhaps, the veneer theory and the friendliness theory representing an orthodox attempt to reconcile between the two of them. And I'm sorry, Wynn, what was the second?
Yeah, so we probably don't have time for quite as thoughtful a treatment of this one, but it's a question about the relationship between veneer theory and naturalism, the kind that Thomas Hardy might be associated with.
Okay, well, I think it lends itself very powerfully to the agendas of the naturalists, both as exemplified by Thomas Hardy in England, but of course also the naturalists Crane, Norris, others who wrote towards the end of the American 19th century, many of whom are ridiculed as muckrakers, right? Those who, they weren't realists describing the garbage, they were the naturalists going in and picking through the garbage, to borrow a description once shared about the naturalists from my good friend here at Boise State, Jeff Wilhelm. But they were dealing with the subjects that nobody wanted to deal with, that polite contemporary society and the representatives of moral respectability were shutting their eyes to. And of course, veneer theory didn't end with the 19th century. Veneer theory is still very much with us, whether it's identified as such or not, and well outside of the sphere of anthropologists. I think in many respects, we can define people politically, across the conservative to liberal progressive spectrum, according to how they might, whether or not they would embrace a pessimistic sense of prospects for progress and social transformation, or whether they embrace the possibilities in defiance of the implications of veneer theory. So it's still very much a power to be reckoned with culturally in our society, and one that I think Melville would recognize off the bat if he could be with us.
That's a great insight. I think we have time for one more, and there was also a question about whether these comments in the chat would be available later on. I think they are. The person to ask is Jocelyn Nunes, but here is a question from Vanessa Gralton, who calls it a bit of a housekeeping question, but you are the person to answer this. Do you feel that more books from Melville's library will surface, or do you believe that most of his surviving personal library has been discovered?
Melville's books continue to surface and will continue to surface. Just a couple of years ago now, his copies of the Roman satirist Juvenal and the Greek playwright Euripides were discovered in Frankfurt, Germany, of all places. Having been rescued decades earlier from a heap of books left out for trash on Gansford Street in Manhattan in the early 1980s. This German national, working in New York, headed to work one day and saw this book of this pile of books left out for trash. Apparently someone had died in a nearby apartment, and the apartment was cleaned out by survivors, and all these books left out for garbage. And this individual went to his workplace and got a hand truck and brought about 2/3 of the stack back with him. Later brought this stack back to Germany, and only a couple of years ago suffered a workplace accident and was on disability, and for the first time started looking through these books closely and found Melville's signature there in the page. And he made contact first with Katie McGettigan, I believe, of the University of London, who had just completed a book on Melville in the material text. She got in touch with contributing scholar to Melville's Marginalia Online, Don Coleman. And through Don, he was brought into contact with us, and we were able to verify the autograph. And on the basis of many more other photographs that he took of Marginalia that he rescued from this pile of books, we were able to identify the unautographed copy of Euripides on account of Melville's Cape Horn inscription in the front of the book, and the style of Marginalia applied to the text. But ever since the 1940s, when my predecessor, Mert Seeltz, first began the work of tracking the recovery of Melville's library, on average, the number of recovered volumes has amounted to about a book a year. Not that they emerge once every year, but the total number that have emerged since he began his work kind of amount to that. And I'm very hopeful and confident, especially in light of these recent emergences, that Melville's Marginalia will continue to emerge and will continue to inject new bursts of energy and information into Melville scholarship. Great question, thank you.
That's wonderful. I have a message here from Jocelyn that if you would like a copy of the chat and questions, you should email her at jnunes, JNUNES, @whalingmuseum.org. And I'm sure that if you have further questions for Steven Olsen-Smith, you can email him as well. You can find his contact information at Melville's Marginalia Online. So I see Amanda, it looks as if we're coming to the end of our time, but thank you so much, Steven, for this wonderful evening.
It's my great pleasure, thank you.
Thank you, Steven. And thank you, Wynn. And thank you, Jocelyn, who was really behind the scenes for all of us there, pulling it all together. We're so pleased that you could join us, and thank you for your incredible questions. And of course, your passion and dedication for Melville and Moby-Dick and the museum. We are grateful. So we encourage you to get your rest tonight and then settle in for the adventure for tomorrow. Be sure to log on to our website at whalingmuseum.org, and you can join the fun with the extracts readings by the Melville scholars, which begin at 11:30 tomorrow morning. Then the main event kicks off right at 12 noon, and be sure to join us for the real treat at 2:30 in the afternoon tomorrow, where you can chat with the Melville scholars a little bit more and kind of raise some more of these questions. So until then, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow, and you can check out our website for all the details. Thanks. Have a great night.
Good night.
Have a great weekend.